On this episode of Take Back the Advantage, we talk about deception failures from World War II and the lessons that can be applied to cyber today. We also interview hacker, Hillbilly Hit Squad founder, cyber deception expert, and Scottish Security Warlock Chris Roberts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and get all the deception content you can handle. Coming up right now. Deception has been around for a long time, and there are countless examples from history where deception was used both effectively and where deception has been used ineffectively. And I think we can learn a lot from that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a quote from the commander of our force. Now, our force was the group in the British military that was the deception group, and they were heavily involved with Operation Fortitude. Now, Operation Fortitude was part of something called Operation Bodyguard. Operation Bodyguard was a deception campaign geared towards facilitating the D-Day invasion at Normandy. And a lot of that deception campaign was about convincing the Germans that the Allies were going to either cross the English Channel at Calais, which is the narrowest part. Oh, very nice. A patch. Very cool. They wanted to convince the Germans of two things. One is that the invasion would come at Calais, and the other one is that the invasion, or a part of the invasion, would come up through Norway. So those deception campaigns were broken down into Fortitude North and Fortitude South. And so the commander of that was this guy named Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways. And he made a comment, which I think is one of the most important comments that I've heard ever regarding deception. And it says, the object of any deception plan is not to make the enemy think something, but to do something. And that's a super important thing. It's not about trying to affect the perception of the adversary. It's about trying to affect the behavior. Now, I had read at one point in time, and I'll be honest, I couldn't find the reference, and I wish I could because it was awesome. But there was a case where, as part of this World War II thing, that they were trying to convince the Germans that as part of Fortitude North, they were trying to convince the Germans through a variety of tactics that the invasion was going to come up through Norway. So they wanted to make sure that they locked those troops in Norway in place so that they couldn't be reallocated. Well, it turned out that a lot of that deception campaign didn't work at all because the Germans just didn't catch on. They didn't see it. They didn't notice it. But they didn't move their troops out of Norway either. In other words, the deception campaign failed, but it accomplished its entire objective. And that's one of the things that's super, super important. There's another example that I was able to find. This one's also during World War II, and this was an example of deception that the Germans were trying to play on the Russians. So this one is German deception focused in early 1942. So the deal was that the Germans wanted to create the impression that a particularly lightly held sector in the front of the war, one that didn't have a lot of troops there, they tried to create the impression that there were many, many, many more troops there. Now, the problem is they did this using only just radio transmission. They didn't add anything else into the mix. They just tried to create some radio transmissions. And there's a maxim in deception that's referred to as Jones's lemma, that basically states that the more channels of visibility, if you will, that you have into deception, the greater the likelihood is that you are going to be able to detect that deception. However, at the same time, the more channels that you can convince somebody through, the greater the likelihood of that deception is going to be believed. So effectively, they tried one simple channel, and the net effect was that the Russians ended up attacking. Now, the weird part about this is it is unclear whether the deception worked or not by itself, right? We don't know whether the Russians didn't catch on to the deception. We don't know if they didn't believe it, or maybe they just didn't even care because they figured they had the troops to deal with it. And I think that is a super, super important point, particularly when you look at what Lieutenant Colonel Strangeway said. Deception is all about an action. It's about trying to get your adversary to behave in a certain way. So even if this particular tactic that the Germans tried, even if it worked, it wasn't clear to the Germans, at least, or to the Russians, what their behavior was supposed to be. In other words, they were focused on the perception of the Germans, or the Russians, I should say, I keep saying Germans. The Germans were focused on the perception of the Russians, not on the actions of the Russians. And when we talk in the world of cyber, the same things apply. Right? Deception is a weird place to be because the technology involved in deception is never the goal of deception. When you deploy a firewall, the firewall is the goal. When you deploy an IDS, that IDS capability is the goal. But deception is all about communicating a message and then trying to attempt to manipulate our attackers' behavior. And unless we understand that truly, we know what message we're trying to put across, we could end up with some very unintended consequences. With deception, we use technology as a tool. Deception is more like a word processing program. You never use a word processing program just to use a word. You don't play with it, right? You use it to create a document. The document is the goal. The tool is what we use to get to the goal. With deception, our goal is to detect attackers, or our goal is to collect threat intel, or our goal is to direct attackers away from production assets and towards notional or deceptive assets. And that goal always needs to be kept in mind, because if we lose track of the goal and just start focusing on the methods of how we're going to achieve that goal, we could end up losing the goal entirely. So I thought that was a really important kind of historical relationship to how we do deception today as well. So today we are going to be interviewing Chris Roberts. So Chris Roberts, again, as I like to do, I just went and stole his bio off of his LinkedIn page. So he's the vCISO advisor, researcher, and hacker for Hillbilly Hit Squad. He, in past lives, he was the chief security strategist for Ativo Networks. He also did work adversarial research and engineering for Lars Consulting. He worked as chief security architect for Calvio Technologies. Again, a couple of deception companies in there as well. And then has a whole bunch of other Sentinel Global, One World Labs, Coalfire Labs, a whole bunch of other stuff. And on his website, and I actually saw the comment, he's also been described as a Scottish Security Warlock, which, I mean, if it was me, I would put that on my business card.
Yeah, I think that one of these days that'll have to go into a card somewhere.
Absolutely. So, Chris, welcome to Take Back the Advantage. Anything you want to add? What do you want to tell the folks listening about yourself?
I think that's plenty. Worst case scenario, if people really want to go figure it all out, they can probably just wander around the Googles and the various other places to go figure out what I am.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, we're talking deception. So I'll just jump in with kind of a good starting point, right? How long you've been involved in deception from a cyber perspective, and well, let's face it, what got you interested?
So the digital side of it, probably not as long as like Lance and some of the other folks in it, but probably the last 5 to 10 years in the purely electronic sense. If we go back prior to that, then we're probably going back, 20, 30 years at least, because obviously deception is to your point, as old as the hills. We've been using it in warfare for quite a long time. And we typically, we'll pair it up with counterintelligence or something else along those lines if we're to make it effective. So all things told, quite a long time. The digital realm, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years or so, something like that.
Awesome. By the way, you need to go and because of the way that this Zoom session that we're on records stuff, I need you to hold up that badge that you had and talk about it, because I want to make sure it's on video. This is cool stuff.
Yeah, so that's the official one. This actually comes from what's known as the Ghost Squadron, which, to your point, goes back to the Second World War. And it was the squadron. It was actually came out of North Africa to begin with the British military. and then the US military took it over and did some actually pretty amazing stuff with it. It was all based around deception. Again, Second World War, normally the second landings, and really working to deceive, the adversary as to placement of troops, number of troops, movement of troops. And it's pretty awesome because basically what they used to do is, you had, I can't remember how strong it was. It wasn't a huge unit, but the unit would go out into the front lines, and you had official troop movements, say, going to the east. But these guys, would go in their just regular lightly armored things with bloody music blaring and stuff they'd recorded of tank movements just blaring through the woods. So as an adversary, you would sit there and you'd be like, holy shit, there's like an entire division coming over the hills. Get that out of here. And, it was effective. I mean, it was very, very effective in a number of different situations. I mean, we did the same thing the first time around when we were over in the sandbox the first time around. The deception that was over there was actually rather fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had, I'm trying to remember who I was talking to, but we were talking about deception and World War II and all that. And apparently it turned out that the Germans were actually really, really, really susceptible to deception for two reasons. One, they had a massive intelligence agency, intelligence operation. So they were out collecting as much information as they could, but they were also pretty gullible. So they were ripe for deception, where apparently, like the Japanese, it was really hard to execute deception on them, not because they couldn't be tricked, because they didn't have the intelligence apparatus to collect the information that the Germans did. And the Italians, on the other hand, they had a big intelligence operation, but I mean, we're talking about the land of Machiavelli, right? This is a country where deception has been part of the culture for hundreds of years. And so they didn't fall for the deception as much as the Germans did. And it really is interesting because that point of the more somebody's looking, the more you have the potential to deceive them is a fascinating, fascinating aspect.
But to your point, when you do that, it's the believability, and it's also the layers. I mean, you hit it perfectly. It's no good just going in there with a single signal. You have to go and look at, especially if you're aware of your adversaries. I mean, we run into this with the digital realm all the time. Just putting one lighthouse out there isn't gonna do anything. I mean, that's basically the origins. You said you talked to Lance in the prior world. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is really one of the original founders of this industry in its modern incarnation. And when we had it out at first, it was a lighthouse. Now it's a little bit more fun.
Yeah, it really is, and this is one of those areas where I think that deception. You talk about it being more fun, right? I mean, if you think about technology and security technology or any technology, it has almost always been that people in IT, our adversary in large part is technology, right? We're trying to beat technology into submission. And once we do that, great, life is good. And it's a very binary kind of a thing. Yeah, I know that complex systems don't always appear to be sort of ones and zeros, but the fact of the matter is that everything is sort of, A or B, 1 or 0. But with deception, the technology isn't that complicated. There are amazingly cool production solutions out there, but the technology isn't really the problem. What the challenge is creating the story. It's understanding the adversary and then creating that story. Thoughts? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you really come down to it, and this is one of the things that I've worked, as you said, inside a couple of those companies, and they put all this glossy propaganda out, and they try to explain it, and they try to basically explain, quit that shit. Our job is to lie. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. Our job is to lie, and lie in the most convincing way possible. That's it. That's all we should be doing. Nothing else. On behalf of our clients, on behalf of research, whatever it takes. Our job, lie. That's all it comes down to.
It really is. And the cool thing about that, and this is where I think that a lot of people have difficulty with deception, is that they're not understanding that. What they're understanding is I have to go buy a piece of technology. And the fact of the matter is, today, right now, you could probably go out and buy any deception technology that's out there, or you could build your own and it's going to work amazingly well because nobody's looking for this stuff today. But as our adversaries, as we start doing more deception, and as our adversaries become more aware, we start needing to create a more pretty picture, right? I got a 3-year-old son. I can draw the worst picture of anything and be like, oh, look, and he's going to be like, yay, it's the sun or whatever, right? But as he gets older, as he becomes more sophisticated as a person, he's going to look for more realism, right? It's okay to have the fake thing when you're 3. And I think that from a deception perspective, most of the attackers are 3, right? They aren't looking for this. Now, this isn't universal. Agreed.
Yeah,
But,
I was going to say, you're going to be careful on that one, definitely. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm going to say, if you looked at the entire population of potential attackers on the planet, most people aren't really looking for deception. Yes, some of the more advanced folks are, but the fact of the matter is, you're right. All this is it's lying, and it's lying convincingly. It's understanding. There's an interesting quote that came out of the Cold War, where the Russians were trying to basically maintain technological equality with the West by basically stealing technology and buying it, under the table and things like that. And so the U.S. became aware of an operation to acquire technology in support of an oil pipeline that the Russians were building during the Reagan administration. And I don't remember the guy's name, but we became aware of the list of all the people that were involved in it. We became aware of the fact that the Russians were going to be targeting a Canadian microchip manufacturer to get this technology. And so one option would have been to use the list of all the bad guys and go deport them or arrest them or whatever. But this economist, and I can't remember the guy's name right now, but he was an economist working for the Reagan administration at the time. He basically said, well, now that we know what the Soviets want, why don't we help them with their shopping? And what they ended up doing was they ended up modifying the microchip technology so that it would actually pass Soviet QA, quality assurance tests, but it would fail in production. And the result of that was the largest non-nuclear explosion ever seen from space. We blew up their pipeline in Siberia. Apparently there was no injuries, but it had 2 effects. First of all, the direct effect of damaging the adversary's technological infrastructure, but it also caused the Soviets to call into question every piece of stolen technology that they had, because they weren't this thing passed QA checks and then it died. So the ability to be able to understand what our adversaries are looking for, what they are expecting to see, and then simply providing them with that is one of the really effective ways to lie convincingly, because it's easier to convince somebody that their foregone assumptions are correct than to try to change those assumptions. So in terms of deception today, what advice, if there was an organization, if there's somebody who's been listening to these things, you're like, yes, this deception stuff sounds awesome. What would your advice be to an organization as their first steps? What should they have? What should they make sure they have in place? What should they be prepared for?
I mean, I think it's, it's probably the same advice we give to any organization on the technology stack. It's know what you have, know what you care about protecting. I mean, there are too many organizations out there, unfortunately, that don't understand what data they have. They don't understand their assets. So it's all very well going, okay, we're going to go basically drop deception in. But if you don't actually know where to protect, what to protect, everything else, it's an entire voyage of discovery at that point in time. So I think that's definitely one area, is trying to help organizations. And that's something that I did at both companies I worked for, was going in there and understanding the lay of the land. And, it's simple questions. What could I do to you today that would cause your company to fail tomorrow, to shut you down? Not just, but to shut you down. And once you've got that question, then you're like, okay, now I know where the core of deception needs to be. But the other part of deception as well is, it doesn't, to your point, it doesn't operate in a silo. It looks to integrate with whatever you have on the endpoint, whatever you have as far as event log monitoring system. And then when you find something, what the hell are you going to do about it? Because if you don't have your humans in place effectively, let alone the policies and procedures and controls to actually deal with it, why the hell bother chasing the technology in the first place?
It's a little creepy, because I've asked this question a few times, and my response to this question is always, know yourself, In other words, know what's on your network, data inventory, data flow analysis, data classification, know what you have, know what's valuable to you, know what's going to cause an impact to your organization. I also throw in a know your enemy, right? Know something about the adversary's techniques or whatever. It's helpful, not required. And then the last one you said is the human piece, right? Let's face it, deception today is largely focused on detecting bad guys, which is super needed because we do a terrible job of that by and large. So what's going to happen when an alert is generated? Like, what are you going to do? Because if you have this amazing deception campaign and alerts get generated and you don't know how to respond, you're sort of, you've put yourself in a less optimal situation.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
It's the same thing. I mean, we see this with surveillance. So in the physical security world, we see the same thing. People put up surveillance cameras, both real and fake, and the fake ones are a legal liability unto themselves. But people put up surveillance cameras, and my first question is, A, are you watching? B, are you watching 24/7? And when you do see me do something, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, and a lot of it is going down to those goals, right? I mean, I've seen a lot of organizations that deploy IDS and SIM or whatever, and when I talk to them, they've deployed it, but they don't really know what they're expecting to do with it because they sort of blend this real-time catch the bad guys with a reactive sort of analysis. And I have no problem with people putting up technology knowing that they're not going to be watching it all the time, particularly if it's data collection technology like SIMs and IDSs and stuff like that. Great, use it reactively. That's cool, as long as you understand going into it that that's what your goal is. But it's that concept of understanding those goals and objectives and having that in place. And with deception, it's the same kind of thing, although I've found that when people deploy deception, they get very confused because the interface that is supposedly going to be alerting everybody to all the bad stuff doesn't have a lot of alerts on it. And that's one of those weird things, like when you talk about IDSs and SIMs and stuff like that, oh, we can generate 1 million alerts an hour. And what am I going to do
about them? Yeah.
Right. So you look at this thing and you plug it in and it just sits there. You're like, wait a minute, is it working? Is it doing something? Well, yeah, it actually is doing something. But this kind of high fidelity detection thing, I think is something that people aren't even used to. Have you seen people struggling?
I have, and what we've tended to do on those kind of situations, because they're like, okay, well, what's it doing? Why is it doing? How's it doing? That's where we tend to get into the continual testing. I mean, we all talk about pen testing, red teaming, purple teaming, whatever else it is. But one of the things, and Chris Nickerson is a huge advocate for this, which is how do we continually test our own procedures? Mm-hmm. So can I set something up that would trigger a deceptive response on a periodic basis? That way, not only do I know it's working, but I also know what controls I have in place and how effectively they're working. So that's always a good way to actually go, to your point, is it switched on? Is it doing what it needs to do?
Oh, yeah. And I talk to people when I talk about deception testing, I talk about the fact that, you should be doing exactly what you said. But I even go so far as to say you should be having maybe a pen testing team that isn't aware of the deception. Try to do it. But you should also have people that are aware of the deception, try to do pen testing, because it's a very different kind of mindset. If I'm doing a penetration test and I know that deception, or I discover that deception is going to be used, my tactics are going to change dramatically, because particularly if as part of that test, I'm concerned about getting caught. And so knowledge of deception can change the behavior of the attackers. But what's cool about deception is it's effectively a story you're telling, and you can change that story on the fly. So even if somebody becomes aware of it, there oftentimes are avenues to be able to change what you're doing so that you can, I'll put it this way. I've heard stories of deception tech, I've talked to different deception technology vendors, and I think it was Ativo, when I was talking to Tony Cole, he was mentioning that they had a report of their technology effectively stopping an insider who was somebody who was involved in deploying the deception technology, right? So somebody with the most insider knowledge was still caught with deception, which I think is an amazing story. I mean, that is a fantastic story.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely there. I mean, I think that's one of the other things that, again, we tend to focus so much on an adversary being on the outside, but we don't always think of the insider threat. And that's, to your point, the deception. If you've built an architecture effectively, you're not necessarily just looking to get people from the outside. You're doing the best to safeguard, what you need to take care of from both insider and external threats. And it's how you tell the story, what you deploy, where you deploy it, how effectively you deploy it, all those other good things.
Ab-
And then how that story evolves with the organization, because it doesn't stay static, obviously.
So one of the kind of pushback items that I get when I talk about deception or doing like a SANS talk or something like that, what I get is basically, if deception is so awesome, why isn't everybody doing it? And I think there are a couple of answers to that. One answer is more people are doing it than you would guess, but they just don't want people to know about it. I'm not advertising my deception based on a perception that if I do, the bad guys are going to know about it and I'll lose some of my advantage. But aside from that, what do you think the biggest hurdle is to a more widespread adoption of deception as a standard mainstream, almost de facto required technology? What's in the way?
I think, you just said it. Basically, if you think about it, if I'm coming into an organization as somebody who maybe doesn't have the gray hair or anything else of being in this industry, you have a shopping list. Your shopping list is typically dictated by whatever fiduciary legal requirements that you have to adhere to. And most of those say, thou shalt put a SIM in place, thou shalt put endpoint in place, thou shalt have a firewall and it needs to be turned on. And, depending upon which requirement you have, depends upon how much logging, policies, procedures, and controls. Your job as a leader in that space is to walk in with that shopping list and ensure that the organization has it in place. Deception has, to the most part, not been on that shopping list.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I had a conversation with somebody the other day. They're like, well, it's not a requirement. I'm like, you're right. It's not a requirement. But if all you're doing is auditing yourself to a requirement, I might as well give you my business card now, because your ass is going to get handed to you. But if you actually want to do the right thing and move to a much more proactive stance, then let's have the conversation around deception. And so I think that's part of it. It's not on the shopping list because because you don't have, HIPAA, PCI, and everybody else breathing down the necks of you, telling you, literally handing you the shopping list of what you have to put into your environment.
Yeah, and to me, that's sort of a problem that I see with the overall security industry. And
Yes.
when all this regulation and all these industry standards kind of came out, and particularly the regulations, it was kind of a boost to security because people had budget. Senior management was like, "Oh, we better pay attention to this." But what has happened as a result of that is this concept of this sort of checkbox type security, where we focus exclusively on methods, not on goals. I must have a SIM. Great. Well, what's your goal with the SIM? To have a SIM. I mean, that's where we are. And deception, one of the things I think I said before was deception is not a goal. Deception focuses on a goal, which could be detection, it could be attribution, it could be threat intel, but it's not the goal itself. So nobody does deception just to do deception. You do it to achieve a goal. And it's a goal-oriented security posture as opposed to a method-oriented security posture. And if I'm a bad guy, all I'm going to do is read every regulatory requirement. I'm going to read what PCI requires. I'm going to read what HIPAA requires. I'm going to read what the Massachusetts privacy law requires. And I'm going to assume that the people that I'm attacking are doing exactly what they are required to do and nothing more, meaning I have a blueprint of their entire security posture. When you throw deception into the mix, you change that game entirely because every assumption that the attacker is making is now potentially wrong. And I think that's a huge important thing.
I think the other thing to be aware of and be cognizant of is most companies will do, not most, a lot of companies will do the minimum basics that need to be governed parts for an audit. So we are basically building security to the lowest common denominator.
Mm-hmm.
in most cases, and that's it. And I mean, that's, this is, and the other problem is as well that we have it is we're also fighting ourselves. Perfect example: an auditor comes into an organization, rather than rolling out the red carpet and going, "Hey, get your ass in here, help me understand what I know, help me understand what I don't know, and then by doing so, you can actually give me the business and the technical justifications to go to leadership and go, hey, here are where my deficiencies are." We put them in a room, we argue with them, and we don't let them out of the room until they've let us past, or we fed them enough shit that, that we've lied enough to ourselves that they still put a check in the box. And so we're fooling ourselves. And again, we're doing it to the lowest common denominator in so many cases. So, until somebody basically hands the industries a shopping list that has deception called out specifically, this is why if you look at marketing for how deception changed in the last few years, it went from just deception technology to deception and detection technology.
Mm-hmm.
Because then what happened is the marketing folks were like, we'll change our propaganda so that not only so we can be included in detection, because obviously detection is IDS, IPS, DLP, and all the other acronyms that we throw at the world.
Yeah, and I agree with that absolutely 100%. And I think that's a good move on kind of just from a marketing perspective. But at the same point in time, I think it sort of limits it because there are so many other things you can do with deception. What would you say is, so along those same lines, what do you think is missing from the deception industry today? What do we need that we don't have?
I think further coverage on the stack. So, I mean, if you look at typical deception that's out there, and this accounts for most of the industries, we can, and I'm going to be agnostic on all the players. We can put things in there that cover identities. We can drop things into memory that cover credentials. We can put printers out there and scanners and industrial control systems. We can put more computers out there that know what the hell to do with. So we have a good middle tier. Mm-hmm. What we don't have in deception is if you go down the stack. So if you think of your OSI model, if I go in at the network and I work my way up the stack, we don't have a good level of the baseline stack. So something like Versec that drops basically, that watches at the machine layer, at the memory layer and everything else, what a process is doing, and then inserts its stuff there. We don't have that. And then way further up the stack, when we start looking at application layer, we can do some basic and some simple stuff there, but the diversity of applications and mobile applications and things along those lines, we don't have that end of the stack well covered either.
So it sounds like what you're saying is we've got the pretty pictures of deception. We've got the fake things that are easy to paint a picture of. But when you start talking about getting down into the stack, and it's almost the same exact conversation going up, which is we could be building deceptive concepts into our applications and into our technology stacks so that we can do things like generating, let's say there's an attacker that, we can easily convince an attacker that a particular piece of technology is vulnerable to a specific exploit. But it's either vulnerable or it's not, at least right now, trying to simulate vulnerability and then create the attacker or give the attacker an impression that their attack has actually worked when it hasn't, built into an application stack. So is that kind of stuff that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's movement. There's a number of initiatives, and I'm working with some folks in the quasi-government side of the world on building deception into the DevSecOps movement. And so we build it the whole way through the stack. And, there's definitely some movement there. And I think if we get that, we'll tackle that end of the scale relatively effectively.
Yeah, I think it gets harder when you start getting down into the underlying concepts of the operating system, because now you're telling Microsoft or you're telling, different Linux platforms or Unix or whatever, hey, recode your operating system so that we can have this cool thing in there. And I don't think they're ready for that one yet.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff at memory there. I mean, we're able to drop things into memory. We're able to drop things into certain other areas, but if you step away from the atypical operating system and you go down to the chipset itself and the instruction sets that run between chips and memory and chips and drives, if you think about it, that goes back to where we started off as hackers. That goes back to assembly layer and the stuff that we're able to do where we're swapping in and out of memory space. So it would be really nice. But again, it's specialized. You know, if you look at the industry, in order to maximize the investment and pay back all those investors that have handed you stupid amounts of money, you kind of have to focus on the core business. And you're not going to find a huge uptick, at least outside of the government and the military folks, that probably care as much about the really low level stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I'm just sort of, as you were going that, I'm sort of picturing integrating deception into things like processor virtualization. So you can almost think about how some of the current research on rootkits is all about virtualization-based rootkits, where I can go and manipulate whatever the hypervisor stack is, whether that's processor virtualization or otherwise. Well, imagine that we did that exact same thing, but we did that in a defensively deceptive way, which would be really, really cool stuff. Because effectively, we're using many of the techniques that the bad guys use against us, against them, in a way that's not hacking back per se, because there are definitely some legal questions about that. But using their techniques, I mean, I think you may be aware, I'm writing a class on deception for SANS. And one of the topics, I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail because it's not quite there yet, but I literally talk about, look, if you're going to set up a honeypot, why not deploy rootkit technology on that honeypot to hide all of your instrumentation from the bad guys? They're doing it against us. Let's do it against them. And it's that concept that I think just changes this game fundamentally.
Yeah. I think it's definitely one of those ones. I mean, I've had some good conversations with a couple of friends, like over at Elusive and Smokescreen and some of those guys, and it's definitely one of those kind of areas that's like, hey, it would be good to do. I mean, Versex's got that stuff covered. Partnering up with some of those guys and going, how can we build deceptive tech? So when you see an MS call that's going down into that stack and doing memory space allocation, you can then secondarily put a bunch of deceptive stuff around there, so you see who is and isn't messing with it. I think that would be fantastic. But again, I think it's one of those where it'd be really good from a research and a government and some very, very high net value systems. But it's the majority rules, unfortunately, in most of the cases, and this does not fall into the majority.
Yeah. So when I talked to Lance Spitzner, he laid out a kind of like a little triangle kind of a deal where the bottom level, there's a 3-layer triangle, and he's talking about the benefits of deception. And he said that, the 85% mature part of deception today is the detection piece, right? We do that really pretty well. The 15% mature piece is the attribution and threat intel collection piece. We're getting there, but it's definitely not fully mature. And then the 5% mature piece at the very top of this is the active attacker engagement. It's the direct involvement with the attacker. And I think that's where we need to get to realize the ultimate benefits of this, because we end up, it's not that we don't get benefits today, but imagine that we can reallocate all those resources from tuning and tweaking our SIMs and filtering out all the false positives and all that kind of stuff, and reallocate those resources to directly engaging with a bad guy attacker, manipulating the story, maybe even, they're trying to download some application. We see that application because we're watching them, so we can on the fly backdoor or Trojan that application that they're putting on our systems. We can change the story that we're presenting to them to try to elicit different responses. We don't have the resources to do that today because they're all spent tuning their SIMs. But imagine we get to that point where we are pitting a human being against another human being, as opposed to today where we pit technology against a human being. Do you think that that's where we end up going?
Nope. And here's my analogy for you. Somebody breaks into your house. What are you going to do?
Well,
simple answer. Give me a simple, I want one sentence. What are you going to do?
I'm defending my house.
Okay. What are you going to do?
Well, I would personally go
one sentence.
I would go get my firearm, and I would call the police, and then I would make sure that I am armed and in a defensive situation in my house.
All right. Are you just going to sit there and watch that person as they rummage around your house, or will you intervene and remove that risk from your house?
I would say, and again, I tend to overanalyze things, so I would say
Don't. You got one
but
sentence.
I would say if I believe that I have the advantage, I will remove them from the house.
Right. That is the answer you will get from 95, you will take about 90 to 95% of the companies out there.
Mm-hmm.
I would do the same thing. I am buggered if I'm going to sit there and watch somebody rummage through my business. I will sit there, they will get a smack upside the head, and the police will find them cuffed on the front lawn. End of discussion.
Mm-hmm.
5% of the organizations out there will be like, let's watch the tactics, let's learn from this, and let's understand how they got in, what they're going to do, what are they going to drop, what are they going to leave, and what are they going to take. And it's the same thing with deception. This is, and we'll name names. This is where I would argue Calvio had a very, very good and compelling story. Their ability to basically build, I used to call it Alice in Wonderland on the fly, it was extremely good. I mean, it was absolutely fantastic.
Yep.
The challenge, most companies don't want to know anything more than the fact that you're creeping around inside my environment. Get the hell out of here. I want to know about it. I want to know where you went. I want to know what you did, which is where a T-Bone, Smoke, and some of those guys do really well.
Mm-hmm.
I want a forensics packet on it, and I want that person the hell out of here.
So let me ask you this, so I was interviewing another SANS instructor, Matt Toussaint, and so I was talking to Matt, and his approach to this is, all right, if you notice a bad guy on your network and you take that smack the mosquito, swat the mosquito approach, you knock them off your network. Well, if it's a sophisticated adversary, well, they now know that there's something going on. Well, what stops them from firing up another DigitalOcean droplet coming in from another IP address, modifying their tactics so that they can try to evade detection? So there's this aspect, what he would say is by swatting the mosquito, you're burning actionable threat intelligence that you have right then and there.
That is a researcher's answer. That is not the answer of a company that is working and maybe $1 million a minute, if they're a financial institution, is flowing through that system. That $1 million a minute is get them the out of my damn system, close it down, get the forensics done, understand how they got in, risk, remediate, learn, move on. And yeah, you're right, they're going to come back in. Everybody does, let's be perfectly honest.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, is where deception itself has the advantage to some degree. You're right, you tripped over one of my landmines. Congratulations. I still got an entire room full of landmines for you without having to change my story and without having to leave you running around my house while I watch you. And again, difference between a researcher and an operator.
Yeah. And I will say the good news that I see with this is, so first of all, it points out that as an organization, if you're going to do deception, you really need to understand what your goals are. But the cool thing is, and I'll throw this out there, so maybe I'm going to tee up a question that I hope I'm going to get the answer I'm expecting. But if you think about deploying deception, if today I want to detect the bad guys and kick them off, and then tomorrow, next week, next year, 5 years from now, I decide, you know what, I really want to get some more threat intelligence. I want to get some attribution information, or to me, you can do that. So you can move in that direction if you need to without having to change your technology too much.
Go buy it. Go buy that intelligence. Let somebody else take the risk. Again, think about it from a corporate standpoint. My job as a corporation is to take care of my organization. If it's my house, in 3 years' time, you come creeping around my house, I'm still going to shoot you in the ass with a salt load. You're still going to end up on the front lawn in handcuffs. Why will I know that that's happened? Because I've been listening to the police reports. I've been watching the annual DBIR report come out. I've learned the tactics. And by the way, those threat intelligence feeds that I've been buying for the last 3 years that are, let's face it, mostly worthless, have actually managed to get some decent information in there that has been built into my deceptive technology. And in 3 years' time, my deceptive technology, hopefully, touch wood, has actually morphed into something where it blends in autonomously. I don't have to tell it that I'm upgrading my Windows systems on my Linux base. It actually learns it, it senses it, and it redeploys. So it's actually much more integrated and camouflaged. Therefore, I don't have to keep leaving you running around my network. Some other bugger can do that. You and your damn researchers, you can go learn that for me. You can tell me, and I'll maintain my house safety.
Yeah, and I guess the point that I was making is not that we should go in that direction, but like if you were going to deploy like we'll look at IDS IPS, okay? If
Yeah.
I'm going to go deploy an IDS in
Yep.
not in inline mode, right? It's difficult to convert that to an IPS because I made a decision and I have to re-architect things for that decision. What I'm saying is with deception, I can do detection today. I don't need to
Yes.
necessarily re-architect my entire concept to go learn something about the attacker's behavior. In other words, it's not something where you have to make these direction. It's not a we hit a fork in the road, right? It's a we can modify things over time to affect the realities that we're running into. Is I guess kind of what I was getting at.
Here's my one call out on that one. And again, you look at all the vendors out there. To me, what you're talking about is the integration.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the biggest things that I liked about where I was last, even though things changed towards the end, is they did deception and they knew they were good at deception, and that was all they cared about. Anything else, we would hand off to somebody else. So if we wanted to deal with it, if the endpoint got infected, it got handed off to the endpoint vendor of choice, and we had a playbook for it. If it was something, if it was IDS IPS, we just handle that crap off. If it was forensics, and so for me, that forward-thinking ideal is where you come into a decision choice as to who do I want to partner with? Do I want to partner with somebody who actually integrates with other things in my environment, or do I want to partner with somebody who keeps everything tight to themselves?
Yeah, and again, it kind of gets down to that, know what your goals are, because if you know what your goals are, you can ask the right questions.
Yeah.
But I will say we go back to the question I asked before about one of the big challenges or issues with deception is and again, I definitely don't work for a deception vendor, but I've talked to a lot of them. And it seems to me that today, most deception vendors are fighting the battle of deception is good. We should look at it. As opposed to my technology is better than my competition's technology. In other words, all these deception vendors are trying to convince people that deception is a worthwhile tactic. And I personally would like to see, and part of the reason why I'm doing this YouTube channel is so that we can start to normalize the appreciation of deception more, that people start to realize that it's a good thing. And that way that the vendors can go fight their battles about, I do deception better than somebody else. These are my differentiating factors. And it just seems to me when I talk to deception vendors that they're fighting the battle of deception awareness as opposed to technology versus technology. Are you seeing some of the same things?
Yeah, I had a really good talk with a couple of the guys over at, funnily enough, Smokescreen and Elusive about this. Obviously, I'd left at TiVo, and those guys, I was friends with them anyway. But I popped up on the radar, and they're like, "Hey, let's have a conversation." I'm like, "I would love to have a conversation about how we elevate the industry. I want to know." To your point, I actually want to have the discussions at an industry level. Why is deception useful? Why is it good? Why should it literally be one of those defaults that you install as opposed to an optional extra that you pay for, off the top? Back to that, I want it on the shopping list. The turf wars as to whether you pick a Calvio, a TiVo, Smoke, Elusive, Trap, or whoever the hell, I don't care about that. To me, that's all that propaganda.
So I got an interesting question, and this is sort of an off the top of my head because I've had some conversations with people, and I want to throw something out there. So you're familiar with things like the Cloud Security Alliance, and there's all kinds of these industry groups that are basically, hi, we exist to promote this industry. Do you think we need a deception alliance? Do we need a vendor independent industry organization that can promote deception, that can do independent research and studies and stuff like that? Do we need something like that, or would we maybe not need? Would we benefit?
That's a tough one, double-edged sword. On one hand, I would say yes. Again, look at CSA. I've done some talks at CSA, and I think they do a fantastic job of educating people as to how they should look at clouds, what they should do, and all this stuff. The flip side on that one is we're already a fragmented industry. Let's be honest. You know, there are thousands of vendors, each one in their own little silo, saying that you need to buy all this. My concern, it would be an interesting conversation to go, where is deception going? Will we actually end up being part of, you know, an event log monitoring architecture eventually? Will we end up being built into, you know, in other words, will our part of the industry actually end up getting fragmented into other areas? Will we eventually end up, you know, in a Palo Alto or a Cisco pocket because it's just part of their entire strategy about how to actually deal with a packet from end to end? So I think if, you know, cloud is the perfect example. Cloud is such a huge part of our industry, and you're not going to have a firewall vendor's not going to be like, well, we've got a cloud offering. I'm like, WTF, you know, you're going to get the scary option. So I see us as a small silo, small but necessary. I'm kind of on that fence as to whether I think, yeah, Microsoft's only got to spend basically, if Microsoft stood up and said, hey, we're going to build a deception architecture into its Windows and its server offering systems, I mean, 3/4 of the population would suddenly go and go in that direction. And, you know, the rest of the industry would be like, what about us? And so I think that's where I would be concerned. I think we need better advocacy, absolutely. My preference would be literally a representative from each one of the companies gets together with like somebody like you and a couple of us who are inside outside, and we work out how to effectively do it without putting an entire alliance together and all the freaking overheads and crap that go with it. I'd rather we did that effectively amongst ourselves.
Well, we will have to revisit that conversation, because I agree with you. I think that it would be beneficial to have something along those lines. What it looks like, how it plays out, you know, I don't know. But right. We'll definitely we'll touch base on that one, because I you know, it's one of those things that, again, as we talked about earlier, I end up, this is something that, I mean, it keeps me up at night, not from a I'm worried perspective, but I wake up in the middle of the night going, oh my gosh, I got to go add this into the course, or I got to go build this tool, or I got to go try this thing, or it's something that, like, I don't remember being as passionate about anything as this stuff. And I think that everybody that I've talked to that knows it sort of feels the same way. Like, it's this amazing thing. We just need to figure out a way to get it out there.
Here's a way of looking at it. And I was talking to somebody about this fairly recently, and they're like, why do I care about deception? I'm like, because let's face it, it is the last bastion. If you really think about it, think when we first started this industry 20, 30 years ago, we had a firewall. That was our defense. Then we basically said, hey, let's put IDS IPS in place. That was our defense because the firewall failed. We're like, okay, IDS IPS isn't working. Let's put DLP in place because we can't stop people from getting shit in. Let's try and stop them from losing stuff out. Well, that failed. Antivirus, let's face it, hasn't exactly had its heyday since about 1990.
Yep.
Even though you've renamed it and called it Endpoint, for God's sakes. I mean, that's
or next gen.
Oh, for fuck's sakes, tell me about it. Jeez. So if you really, really think about it, we've put all of these barriers in place. We've put all of this in place, all this technology, again, ignoring people and process. We've put all this in place. And it's all failed in one way, shape, form, or another. Because if it hadn't failed, we wouldn't exist. There would be no need for deception if Endpoint did its job. If a firewall, IDS, IPS, DLP hit did their job, there would be no need for deception. If we trained users properly, we'd have no freaking need for deception. But because everything else has failed, we are literally the safety net. And here's my concern. There isn't another safety net after us. Yeah, we don't have anybody else to rely on.
Yeah, yeah, that is a slightly concerning thing. And I will say, if you want to relate cyber to, like, you know, physical world stuff, right? I mean, originally we built big castles, and then we realized that we can go bash those castle wall downs if we have the right, we can either bash them down, we can dig under them, we can whatever. So then we changed our defensive posture to one that's more based on rapid response and all that kind of stuff in the real world. And that has a place, but the fact of the matter is when you talk about kind of military operations, deception is a part of that, and there's no questioning that. Like, not every military commander is adept at deception. Deception isn't used all the time, but it has been used in so many cases to such great effect. And it's the piece that we've been missing. My absolute favorite quote on deception comes from an author who unfortunately passed away, a guy by the name of Barton Whaley. And so he stated in his book, Practice to Deceive, he said, in combat, deception strengthens the weaker side. When all other factors are equal, the more deceptive player or team will always win. When you talked about all those technologies, about evading firewalls, evading IDS, evading antivirus, all that, that's our adversaries using deception against us. They've been doing it for 20, 30 years in different levels of sophistication, and we just simply haven't. And in all honesty, I think that if you wanted to point out one reason why our blue team operations have just consistently failed over the years, I think, and I understand it's a massive oversimplification, but I think that that's one of those big reasons that the bad guys are using deception. We're not, and they're just slipping by everything that we're doing. And we have the option to change that game. And to your point, what happens when the bad guys figure out how to completely circumvent deception? I don't know. And I don't know if it's possible. I mean, in other words, we haven't seen that. But if it happens, where do we go?
We have no other bastion, let's be perfectly honest. I mean, there's an argument to say encryption, but that fails because I'm going after an open system. Mm-hmm. The system has already been decrypted. I am on it watching live traffic. I mean, there's this whole charging down the zero trust model. And again, if I'm sitting on your computer watching you, I've bypassed all of those controls. The only real hope that you have is the you that I am watching is not the real you, and it's the deceptive you. Mm-hmm. There is nothing else.
Yeah, it is a little terrifying, but I will say that conceptually, the level of detail and depth we can go into in deception is staggering. I mean, we could go to the level of creating fake Facebook accounts to talk about fake users, that talk about fake technology, that, we can generate fake network traffic. We can do fake ARP cache entries and fake map drives. And in other words, we can dig down and create a picture that is believable to the point of somebody who knows what they're looking at would actually be able to believe it. We can get there. And the attackers today, most of them aren't ready for that, right? If we went to that level, the attackers they will have never been at such a disadvantage. But what happens when they figure out a way? Because, I mean, I look at it like my dad used to have bird feeders in his backyard. And he used to like watching the bird feeders, whatever. But then, of course, there's the bane of bird feeders, squirrels. And so he would try all these different ways of trying to get the squirrels away from the bird feeders. And for a long time, those efforts failed. And it's not because the squirrels are smarter than my dad. Well, probably not. But it's that the squirrels wake up every single day and do nothing but try to figure out how to get past whatever contraption or thing that my dad put up, where my dad might spend 15, 20 minutes a week trying to stop the squirrels. And that's where we are, right? The bad guys collectively are spending every second of every day trying to figure out ways to get past what we do.
So without wanting to get the ire of the animal rights people, shoot the squirrel. End of discussion. Yeah. Problem solved. And that's my argument for this is my argument for not wanting to have somebody inside my environment trying to figure out, because I don't, to your point, I don't have all day to play chess with you as you're walking around my environment. It's simple. You come in, you get shot, end of discussion. That solves that problem. Now, you might send another squirrel in, I'll shoot the damn thing. And eventually, you know, you're right. I mean, there's an escalation issue. There's all sorts of other things in there. But if I don't let you wander around my environment trying to learn what's real and what's not real, you don't get eyes into my environment to learn that effectively. So there is another reason for doing that. And, you know, at this point, I've put the hillbilly hat on, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be honest, I mean, I think that the weird part is when you talk about all this stuff, the thing that I love about deception is, and this is going to sound kind of weird and very kind of pandering and taking the easy way out, but I've talked to a lot of different people that have different perspectives on how deception can be used, and they're all right. Right. In other words, it's not that this way is right and this way is wrong. It's what do you want to get out of it, and what are you prepared to do? Right. If you have an organization that has people who do nothing but, you know, threat intel collection and research attackers, if you have a big giant budget with lots of people that can focus on this stuff, do it. If you don't have it, then just kick them off. It's one of those things that you can do it all. Just depends upon what's going to work for you. And I think that is really a cool thing. Yeah. What would you say when we start talking about, you know, deception and all that kind of fun stuff? What would you say, you know, having interacted with the people who've used it, having, you know, been involved in this for a long time, what would you say is the biggest surprise that people experience when they implement deception, good, bad, or ugly, whatever? What do you think is the thing that people don't realize before they deploy deception that once they do, they're like, oh my gosh?
Probably the effectiveness, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we've all, let's face it, we've all been fairly jaded in this industry with, like, you know, the promises of wealth beyond avarice for whatever solution you want to put in. I think what I like about the deception technology is, and really this is relatively vendor agnostic on this one, is once it's implemented, and there's tuning, no two ways about it, there's definitely tuning, but I think that tuning is also a voyage of discovery for companies. They're like, I didn't realize we had that VLAN. I didn't realize that person was doing that. Once you get past that, to your point, I think it's two things. One, it doesn't chirp until it's needed. And then when it does chirp, you sure as hell better be paying attention to it. And I think that's part of it. The effectiveness, especially if you have deployed things on endpoint, you've put stuff in memory, you've put stuff in disk, you've put printers out there and cameras and all the other crap that you have in your environment. If you've done it effectively, then I think that's where the effectiveness, people suddenly go, this actually works. No shit, Sherlock.
I think you actually pointed out one of the biggest challenges to talk about deception, because it is one of those things where when you try to lay it out and you say, this is what it can do, and it really is this easy and this effective, people are like, no way.
Yeah.
Nope, can't be. Nope, sorry, I don't believe you. And it really is that it's just good and easy and cost effective. I mean, it's this it's this magic bullet that, and I don't say that in I say that knowing what I'm about to say, right? We always talk about there are no magic bullets, and I agree that there are no magic bullets, but this is, at least from what I've seen, the closest thing that I've seen to a magic bullet that I've ever seen in this industry, and that's almost its drawback, right? You know, it's like you read those articles about, hey, take this little weird, 12-volt fan and stick it in the, air intake of your car, and it's going to give you 150 miles per gallon. No, it's not, right? It's snake oil. And deception sounds like a lot of snake oil because it just seems too good to be true. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm trying to just get out there is, look, this stuff actually does work. I mean, the way that I always put it is, imagine that you're the person that puts up a Netcat listener listening on port 80 on your laptop. Nobody connects up to there. when somebody does, and you get, as long as you did it in verbose mode, right? When somebody does, and you get an IP address, wait a minute, why did this IP address just connect up to my system? And if that's what you did, and you're the person in your environment that caught the bad guy the day after they got on there, as opposed to 7 months later, think of the win, right? No cost, low risk, win. That's amazing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's, that's the nice thing about it. I mean, having worked inside a couple of the organizations, it's actually really nice, to your point, to see when it's implemented, when it's integrated, that it does what it says on the box.
Mm-hmm.
And I think but there's caveats with that, because again, the challenge in this industry, there have been a couple of players in this industry that haven't done and haven't been able to execute against what they've said, or like, unfortunately, where I'm, one of the organizations I've hung out with, they've added too much complexity in there. It's, guys, just keep it freaking simple. Stop trying to be everything to everybody. Focus on the one thing, do it properly, do it well, and then expand it, to how we've talked already.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the approach. I talked to Haroon Mir from Thinkst, and I think that Thinkst has that approach, which is, we're going to make something that is not gigantically functional, right? It's a simple little box that you can buy for $1,000, $2,000, whatever it is. You drop it on your network. 5 minutes later, you have a fake insert something here, right? And it could be a Windows computer. It could be a database. It could be an industrial control system. And that's it. It's not this gigantic plug into trunk ports and all this kind of stuff. It's simple, and you can throw it up really easy. Now, does it have the functionality of all those other solutions? No. And perhaps that's a good thing.
Canary's got the same way, exactly the same logic.
Yep.
Canary's the same way. I mean, it does what it says on the box. It's going to keep it simple. It's going to do what it needs to do. And for like an SMB environment, does great. Smoke's in the same way. Mm-hmm. But there are definitely a couple of them out there that are obviously chasing the enterprise stuff. So they feel they have to integrate more effectively. Absolutely understand that. Good playbooks. But then you start crossing into other areas. And for me, it's like, quit that. Stick to what you're good at. Stick to what you said you were good at. And basically, I just rewatched, I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, I just rewatched the Jiro, I Dream of Sushi. Mm-hmm. This is one person who has spent 75 years of their life perfecting one thing, and they are the best in the world at it. Why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we say, look, we will build the best deception product ever, and we're going to stick to just deception, and we'll do it for enterprise, and we will integrate with everybody else. We won't try to experiment. We won't go into endpoint. We won't go into this. We will be the best. We will spend the next, I don't care if we spend the next 5 years. This guy spent 75 years. Mm-hmm. But we don't want to do that. And that frustrates me as well, to be honest.
And I think that kind of goes back to a topic we mentioned before, which was, right now, the deception industry is fighting awareness issues and kind of normalization of the concept. But those same companies that are just trying to convince people that deception is good and you should do it are creating their technology according to the way that you would sell a firewall, which is, we already know that firewalls are good. Let me add a whole bunch of features and things to make my firewall different from everybody else's firewall. So nobody's paying attention to these features. They're just trying to be sold on deception in general. And so you end up with this weird approach where the messaging isn't in line with what the market requires. Market requires simplification. Make this simple. Once we get past the simplification and people start doing it, then we can start adding. But let's fight the battle that deception is good first, and then move on to, I do deception better once we get that first battle won.
I cannot agree with you anymore. I mean, it's, having lived inside one, and the next piece of marketing propaganda comes out from somebody that references acronyms, and you're like, why are we just added an extra half a dozen acronyms to this thing? I have no clue what this is. It's like, this and this and this. And I'm like, what are we trying to sell? And that's my frustration. Again, to your point, our job is still to educate a market, and yet we're making it more complicated, and we're making it more complex by adding more words that nobody understands.
Yep.
Keep it simple, stupid. End of discussion.
Yep. So we're getting kind of, on in this interview. I don't want to keep people for too much longer, but I'll leave you with two things that are kind of related. So one is last thoughts. What do you want to leave everybody with? And oh, by the way, if you want to include into that, what are you doing? What is Hillbilly Hit Squad? What's going on with you today? You are more than welcome to do that.
So I'll leave people with, to your point, I'll leave people with two things. To me, we touched on this right at the beginning. I think before you go charging into deception, know yourself. Know thyself, and then know others. So go into deception, but go into it with eyes wide open. But to me, the big thing is also ask the right questions. There are enough people, you've mentioned them. I mean, you've talked to them, we're talking now. There are enough people who are in the industry, but maybe not absolutely affiliated in the industry, that will give you these honest opinions. And to me, it's you take these and then you look at yourself and go, what do I need? And then you go to the companies and go, what have you got? And if those two align, you're in good shape. From my standpoint, I mean, I'm causing chaos in the world. I'm having a ton of fun. So Hillbilly Hit Squad is really, there are a number of us inside the company. It's research, virtual CISO, consulting stuff. I've had the Jesse and I and a couple of others have had it hiding behind the scenes for more years than I care to think about, but I'm using it these days. Obviously, I came out of the company I was working for. I did not want to jump straight into another company. So we basically brought Hillbilly up to the top, and I'm doing a bunch of virtual CISO work. I'm actually having fun. I'm doing some stuff in the actual artificial intelligence arena, but I'm doing it by holding everybody else's feet to the fire. So I get to basically beat the crap out of the people that were like, oh, we've got the world's best AI. And I'm like, no, you don't.
So that brings up an interesting point. One of the people that I interviewed that I actually forgot to tell you about before was there's a professor from Columbia University, Salvatore Stolfo.
Right.
And so he also founded Allure Network, is another deception company. But
Yeah.
he's done a lot of work on artificial intelligence and machine learning around information security and deception. The dude's got like 90 patents to his name and stuff like that. So way smarter than I am, or it's just way more prolific at patenting stuff, whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, better lawyers.
Yeah. And one of the things that he was working on, I thought was kind of interesting was, so if you think about trying to create deceptive documents, and he kind of focused on email, right? If you're a bad guy, email is a gold mine because everything's in email. So what if you wanted to create fake emails? He's like, well, what you can do is go back 5 years ago and grab some email and then modify it to reflect current, to make it seem like it's today. But then he was like, but you got to understand, if you do that, things like the dates, like we're going to do this on Tuesday, or on the 15th, or in other words, there's all these relative date references. So he's actually built some AI that goes through and can modify all of that stuff to make it internally consistent, that all those references to dates and things like that match up with what's going on, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. It might be a bit overkill, but
you think?
Yeah.
Back to this academia versus reality. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. But it's one of those things that I like that he's doing stuff like that, because while we might not need to do that stuff, the fact that it can be done is an interesting aspect. And that we have people pushing that envelope in those purely academic ways, because eventually we, as the non-academics, are going to take what we can from that academic research and turn it into something that's practical and useful and all that kind of stuff, which I think is really cool. So yeah, you brought up the AI stuff, so I meant to mention that I had chatted with him, and it was also a very interesting conversation. Awesome. Well, excellent. I have thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with a Scottish Security Warlock. I haven't done that before, so that's pretty cool stuff. Thank you so much.
This is fun.
And I will extend an invitation. I will reserve the right to reach back out to you if you enjoyed this, and if there's anything that you want to talk about, or you're doing some research, or you come up with some cool whatever, let me know. It doesn't have to be this big long interview format, but I'm just trying to get some visibility out there in terms of deception and getting people to understand what it is. So thank you so much for jumping on this.
No, this is appreciated. Thanks. Fun time. Definitely fun time.
Awesome. So for those of you who are watching, guys, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel. That definitely helps out. If you want to get updates for when new content gets pumped out there, click that little bell. Like the video, share it with your friends, all that kind of fun stuff. And by the way, one thing is super helpful is comment, right? If you liked what you heard here, if you disagree with what you heard here, if you have questions, if there's things that you want to hear on this topic, please comment so that way we can kind of keep this as real as possible. So once again, thank you guys all for participating. Chris, thank you so much as well.
Appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
The more we can do this, the more we can come together, and I'll just close out with we can come together to take back the advantage.